Welcome back everyone, and in today's video lesson we are going to look at multi-level voice leading. Now there's a couple of examples we want to look at. One is going to be what happens when we have simultaneous voice leading. That'll be our example one. And what happens when we have sort of micro versus macro voice leading, and we did refer to that in our previous music theory video lesson. So looking at example one, what happens when we have simultaneous voices, right? What's going to happen there? So looking here, we've got voice one. And we're going to compare voice 1 to V2, voice 2, as well as to voice 3. All right, so when I think about voice 1 to voice 2, let's go ahead and label out some of these intervals here. And that's going to give us a major third, a minor third, major third, and a major third. Now, if I think about that right away, I should be able to identify, well, those voices are changing, and that's going to give me similar motion. How can I peg that? Well, that's because the intervals are changing. If the intervals are changing, it means that they, like here, major third to a minor third or minor third to a major third. If the interval size is changing, it means that they're not always going the same distance, right? They're definitely going the same direction, but not by the same distance. Now let's compare up here at the top and let's consider what's going on with V1 compared to V3. So we're always doing V1 to something. So V1 to V3 or V1 to V2. I'm not comparing V2 to V3. You could. You absolutely could, but we're not going to do that in this example. And if I were to do that, then I would see that this is a perfect fifth, perfect fifth, perfect fifth, perfect fifth, and perfect fifth. And so you can see we have definitely multiple examples of voice leading here, because if I look at this scenario from V1 to V3, well, that's going to be parallel. So that's interesting. So we have parallel voice leading sort of stacked on top of similar voice leading. Now, one other example that we talked about before is we talked about this idea about instantaneous versus the average, right? And so if I think about the instantaneous going through this, so looking at V1, and I'm going to look at V1 to V2 now, which is like this. And if I think about the instantaneous, well, V1 to V2 at this point is parallel. And from A sharp to G compared with C sharp to B, that's going to be similar. And this is going to be similar. And this would be parallel. And why? And it has to do with because, you know, we have major third, and then the interval size changes, minor third, major third, so on and so forth. And so this would give us parallel, similar, similar, and parallel. And so if I looked at the instantaneous voice leading, then you might go, gosh, it's changing parallel, similar, similar, parallel, which is very complicated. And so a lot of times we just consider the average voice leading, which is going to say that that is similar. Okay. So you can do it either way, but most people are going to go with the average. It's just much simpler because the instantaneous is changing so rapidly. It's hard to keep a tab on what's going on. Looking at example 2, and starting here, again, we look at V1 and just make some quick observations here. V1 is the same voice over and over again. Notice that V2, this is basically saying, hey, G, 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 F sharp, da, 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 E, you know, all the way through. All right. If I think about, again, going from V1 to V2, hopefully you recognize that this is going to be oblique, right? This is an oblique. And why is that oblique? It's because I have this same voice over and over and over and over and over again. All right. And then here, same thing. This would be oblique. This section is oblique. This section is oblique. This section is oblique. Okay. We could also look at here. What would that be like? Well, that is going to give us similar motion. And why is that similar? Because let's think about the intervals that occur there. We have a minor third. We have a minor third. We have a major third. And once again, we have a minor third, okay? And I'm not going to do the rest of them here. You can figure them out on your own, okay? But you can see that the interval sizes are definitely changing, which is going to give us similar motion. Now, there's a couple of other ways that we can look at this. And I want you to notice that since V1 is basically the same voice over and over and over again, what if I were to replace that with, say, X, right? What if instead of calling this E, F sharp, G, and A, what if I just said, hey, what if I called that X? Well, then wouldn't this be X? And then wouldn't this be X as well? And so now I can really think about, well, gosh, wait a minute. I've got X that occurs here, X versus this voice. That actually looks like oblique because I have this idea about one voice, one consistent voice with a voice that changes, and here one consistent voice with a voice that is changing, one consistent voice with a voice that is changing. And so that's oblique motion. And so we get this idea about having micro versus macro. What do I mean by that? Well, the macro thing is if I'm looking at the whole big picture, right? The enchilada here, the whole thing, and calling that some sort of variable and recognizing that this compared to that is oblique. But if I'm looking at the sort of inner pieces of this, the components of that, I can see that this has a certain interval and this has a certain interval and this has a certain interval, which is going to give us similar. We've looked at micro versus macro, and we've also looked at instantaneous versus the average voice leading. And so generally, we like to consider the average voice leading. And in terms of using micro versus macro, again, that's really kind of a personal choice about how you want to set things up. And it's also really your personal choice about what you consider to be V1 or V2. All right, so thank you for joining us today.